Rob Hall was the kind of man climbers trusted with their lives. Tall, calm, and quietly intense, he had already guided 39 paying clients to the summit of Everest, more than anyone else in history. He wasn't the most famous mountaineer in the world, but among those who truly knew the Himalayas, he was one of the most respected. His voice was steady, his decisions deliberate. He made people feel like if anyone could get them to the top and back alive, it was Rob Hall. He had turned his expertise into a business adventure consultant, offering guided expeditions to the world's highest peaks for clients with more money than experience. And Everest, the roof of the world, had become the crown jewel of that business. By 1996, Everest was no longer the untouchable peak of legends. It had become something else, a proving ground for bankers, surgeons, lawyers, and dreamers. If you had $65,000 and a little ambition, you could buy a shot at the summit. Commercial expeditions were exploding in popularity, and base camp had started to resemble a small alpine village. Satellite phones, espresso machines, even movie nights in heated tents. The mountain was changing, and Rob Hall was trying to adapt without compromising the strict safety principles that had kept him and his clients alive for over a decade. In the spring of 1996, Hall prepared to lead his 6th expedition to Everest. He handpicked his guides, arranged Sherpa support, secured weather forecasts, and coordinated oxygen supplies. His wife, Dr. Jan Arnold, was also a climber. She had summited Everest with Rob in 1993. This time, she stayed behind 7 months, pregnant with their first child. They spoke about the risk, of course, but Jan trusted him. If anyone could thread the needle between risk and safety on a mountain like Everest, it was Rob. Among his clients that season was Doug Hansen, a 46-year-old postal worker from Seattle. Doug wasn't wealthy. He had scraped together sponsorships and savings to attempt the climb in 1995, but had been forced to turn back near the summit due to bad weather. That experience had haunted him. He returned in 1996 with Rob's personal assurance. "This time, we'll get you there." Another client, Beck Weathers, was a 50-year-old pathologist from Dallas. He wasn't climbing to prove anything to the world, just to himself. Beck had battled clinical depression for years, and mountaineering had become a way to reclaim control. His wife, Peach, didn't understand the obsession. He had missed anniversaries, birthdays, entire seasons of his children's lives, chasing peaks around the world. This climb, he'd promised her, would be the last. Hall's clients were a mix of dreamers and professionals, none with elite-level climbing resumes, but all driven. There was Lou Kosesh, a Michigan attorney with a reputation for grit. There was Yasuko Namba, a 47-year-old Japanese executive, attempting to become the oldest woman to complete the 7 summits. And there was journalist John Krakauer, assigned by Outside Magazine to write a feature on the commercial climbing industry, a story that would eventually become a best-selling book and define the disaster in the public imagination. Arriving in Nepal, Hall's team made the long trek through the Khumbu Valley toward Everest Base Camp. They passed through tiny villages and ancient monasteries, across suspension bridges swaying high above glacial rivers. Porters and yaks hauled crates of equipment. Every step took them higher into the thin air of the Himalayas. By the time they reached base camp, perched at 17,600 feet, they had entered a world where helicopters struggled to fly, and even the simplest movement left you breathless. But they weren't alone. That season, Everest was crowded. Over 30 expeditions from all over the world were attempting the climb. Rival guide, Scott Fisher, founder of Mountain Madness, was there with his own clients, including socialite Sandy Pittman, who had brought crates of gourmet food and a satellite uplink to file blog updates. David Brishes was also on the mountain, with an IMAX film crew, shooting footage for a giant screen documentary. Everest had become not just a destination, but a spectacle. With so many teams on the mountain, coordination was critical. Rob Hall and Scott Fisher met with other expedition leaders to plan rope-fixing responsibilities, set radio protocols, and schedule summit attempts to avoid traffic jams. Hall emphasized discipline. He set a strict turnaround time, 2 p.m. No matter where you were on the summit push, if you hadn't reached the top by then, you'd turn around. No exceptions. The goal wasn't just to summit, it was to survive. Over the next 3 weeks, Hall's team moved up and down the mountain to higher camps and returning to base to acclimate. They crossed the deadly Khumbu icefall, a maze of shifting ice towers and deep crevasses that could collapse at any moment. They spent nights at Camp I, Camp 2, Camp 3, higher, colder, more unforgiving. The oxygen was thinner, the temperatures more brutal. Their bodies began to weaken, even as their resolve hardened. Hall remained the steady hand guiding them. He encouraged, assessed, adjusted. He knew every contour of the route. He made backup plans. He watched the weather obsessively. His guides, Zandy Harris and Mike Groom, were experienced and well respected. His Sherpas were loyal and skilled. It was a well-oiled machine. Still, Everest is not a place that rewards confidence. It punishes delay. It punishes emotion. By May 8th, Rob Hall and Scott Fisher had both decided to launch summit bids on the night of May 9th. The forecast showed a short window of calm weather. It was the best shot they were going to get. They planned to leave from Camp 4 at midnight, climb through the night, and reach the summit by early afternoon. Every climber had a checklist. Every bottle of oxygen was counted. Every radio frequency was tested. At Camp 4, perched precariously on a narrow shelf at 26,000 feet, there was no sound except the wind and the hiss of oxygen masks. Rob checked on each client, inspecting gear, asking questions. He wasn't sleeping. He rarely did the night before a summit attempt. He had done this climb more times than almost anyone alive, but it never got easier. Midnight came. The climb began. The summit push began in total darkness, with headlamps glowing like stars against the ice. Climbers shuffled across narrow ridges and up fixed ropes, their crampons scraping against rock and snow. Every step felt like dragging a sandbag uphill. The temperature was well below freezing. The air was so thin, your breath came in ragged gasps, even with supplemental oxygen. By 1 a.m., Rob Hall's team had begun the steep ascent of the South Col, climbing toward the balcony and the south summit. The first major setback came early. The fixed ropes, which were supposed to be installed the day before by Sherpas from multiple teams, weren't in place. Climbers arrived at the Hillary Step, one of the most technically demanding parts of the routine, to find a bottleneck forming. Dozens of people were lined up, unable to proceed until the ropes were secured. Time began bleeding away. Rob was frustrated. He had emphasized rope prep in the planning meetings. Without those ropes, the entire summit schedule was compromised. Delays stacked up fast. 1 hour turned into 2. It was a bad sign. Meanwhile, clients were beginning to show signs of exhaustion. Doug Hansen, who had struggled during the acclimatization climbs, was falling behind, but he pushed forward. This was his second attempt. He wasn't going to turn back. Rob stayed close to him, checking in constantly. Beck Weathers, farther back, began to experience serious vision problems. His corneas, previously operated on, were reacting to the altitude and UV exposure. He was going blind. Rob told Beck to wait just below the summit while he continued on with Doug. He'd pick him up on the way back down. They reached the summit around 2:30 p.m. past the turnaround time, but Rob let Doug go ahead anyway. The moment meant everything to him. Doug stood at the top of the world. Moments later, he collapsed. They were out of oxygen. Rob radioed base camp. Doug is down. We need help. But help was impossible. A storm was blowing in faster and more violent than anyone predicted. By 3 p.m., wind gusts of over 70 miles per hour ripped across the ridge. Visibility dropped to 0. The cold became lethal. Across the mountain, climbers became disoriented. People wandered off the trail. Some sat down in the snow and never got up again. Back near the Hillary Step, Rob was trying to revive Doug. Other climbers were already heading back. Scott Fisher was nowhere to be seen. He was still climbing hours behind, severely fatigued. Andy Harris, one of Rob's guides, turned back to help and never returned. By 5 p.m., night was falling again. Rob Hall, Doug Hansen, and Andy Harris were still high on the summit ridge, trapped in the storm. Below them, Beck Weathers was still sitting where Rob had left him alone, half blind, and now being buried in snow. Rob's radio calls became more desperate. Doug can't move. We're out of oxygen. We need help. But no help was coming. Not at that altitude. Not in that storm. Not when every step in the death zone was a fight for survival. And still Rob refused to leave. He had made a promise, and he was going to keep it by morning. May 11th, the storm was still raging across Everest's summit ridge. Winds tore through the death zone with brutal force, and most climbers were barely clinging to consciousness. Radio contact with Rob Hall crackled through. He was still alive, but frostbitten and unable to move. Doug Hansen was gone. Andy Harris too, both likely frozen during the night. Still, Rob stayed where he was, refusing to save himself. At base camp, a satellite radio call was patched through to New Zealand. Jan Arnold, Rob's wife, answered. 7 months pregnant with their first child, she heard her husband's voice from the top of the world. He was calm, gentle, trying not to worry her. He told her he was comfortable, that he was going to try to sleep. She knew what that meant. Together, they picked a name for their daughter, Dash. Sarah Chen told him she loved him. He said he loved her too, that he was at peace. The line stayed open until it finally went quiet. It was the last time anyone would ever hear Rob Hall's voice. Elsewhere, disaster continued to unfold. Beck Weathers, who had been left for dead twice, somehow stood up. Covered in frostbite, half blind, and with no gloves on his swollen hands, he began staggering alone toward Camp 4. Climbers inside their tents saw a silhouette barely recognizable. His face was frozen black, his right arm stiff, shoulder high from the cold. But he was alive. Against every odd dot, other survivors. Fox, Sandy Pittman, Tim Madsen had spent the night huddled in the storm. Some couldn't walk. Others were catatonic. Miraculously, Russian climber Anatoly Baukriv descended alone into the whiteout 3 times, dragging people back to safety by sheer force of will. Without him, the death toll would have doubled. And still, Rob Hall remained up high, waiting beside a man he refused to abandon. That kind of loyalty is rare, especially when it becomes fatal. The storm broke, the sky cleared, but the aftermath was unlike anything Everest had seen. 8 climbers were dead. Their bodies remained scattered across the mountain, frozen into the ice. Among them were Doug Hansen, Yasuko Namba, Andy Harris, Scott Fisher, and Rob Hall. Had climbed for a different reason. None had made it back. Beck Weathers was airlifted off the mountain in a history-making rescue. A helicopter, piloted by Colonel Maiden Casey, flew higher than any chopper ever had, nearly falling from the sky just to extract him. Beck's hands, nose, and parts of his face were amputated. But he lived, and he went home. To his wife. To his children. To the life he nearly threw away. Jan Arnold gave birth to Sarah Hall just weeks later. She never met her father, but she would grow up knowing that he died because he kept a promise to stay with someone until the very end. Even when no one else could. Rob Hall's body remains on Everest to this day, visible near the south summit. Some climbers pass him in silence. Some leave flowers. Others can't bear to look. In the years that followed, the 1996 Everest disaster became legend. Books were written, films produced, debates flared about commercialization, judgment, ego. But the truth is simpler. Everest punished a moment of delay, a moment of loyalty, a few fatal minutes too long at the top. Rob Hall wasn't reckless. He wasn't arrogant. He was a guide who believed in taking care of his people even when it killed him. That's what makes his story unforgettable. Not just how he climbed, but how he stayed to the very end.